Friends, thank you for joining us today. Today's topic is jumping on the protest bandwagon. And it's a difficult topic, but it's a necessary one that we need to have. It needs to be an open discussion. And as Christians, we need to hold each other accountable for so much in our daily lives. And this in particular is something that we need to do and we need to talk about and we need to take action on. All right, so Matthew chapter 25 tells us that Jesus said, what you do for the least of these among you, my brothers and sisters, you do it for me. All right, so Jesus is telling us, all right, that we need to look out for one another. We particularly need to look out for the least of these among us. All right, we need to be responsible, accountable, and take action for those in need. All right, so last month, just a few days after the George Floyd death, a bishop, a prominent bishop in a mainstream denomination, sent out a letter that was titled Taking Action on Systemic Racism. All right. The letter was striking in that it addressed the George Floyd death, but somehow linked it to systemic racism. The investigation into George Floyd's death and murder was only a few days old, and at that point there were no indications that race had anything to do with his death. Fast forward to today, well over 3 weeks later, and there are still no indicators that race had anything to do with George Floyd's death. No one has come forward to suggest that. None of his friends or even enemies have come forward to say, hey, we heard this guy say this, this, and this. He's clearly a racist. None of that has happened. All right, so we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to look at some of the issues surrounding this letter in particular. And one of my concerns is that this letter appears to pander to a group of individuals who are looking for something deeper in the George Floyd death than the facts indicate at this point. All right, sending out a letter on systemic racism while pandering to these individuals also flames the fires that are burning in our cities at this current time. Now, I searched this bishop's past history and speeches, written word, video, and I cannot find a single instance since this person became a bishop, at least, and I went back further than that, where this bishop has spoken out on systemic racism before, or that this bishop has spoken out on murder before, or violent crime before. Couldn't find any of those things. So my question is, did this bishop jump on the George Floyd protest bandwagon? Or is it possible this bishop suddenly became woke following the George Floyd death? Now, woke, if you're not familiar with that term, is a new term that's used to describe the sudden awakening of some circumstance. So it's possible this bishop became woke to the issue of systemic racism following the George Floyd death. But if that's the case, a few days after this letter was sent out, on May 31st, 18 black lives, men, women, and children, were murdered in the city of Chicago in one day in a 24-hour period. 18 Americans dead. Just a few days after this letter was signed out. This bishop has said nothing on that. This bishop didn't issue another letter. This bishop didn't preach a sermon. This bishop apparently did nothing on that issue. 18 dead Americans. Now, since that time period in Chicago, 28 more black Americans were murdered. All right. In the past 5 months leading up to this date, starting January 1st of 2020, all right, leading up to today, 257 black Americans, some whites mixed in that, have been murdered in Chicago. Now, I use Chicago as an example because it's one of the most drastic, but right behind Chicago we have Baltimore and Detroit and St. Louis, Kansas City. We have some other areas where there are extreme examples of this type of violent crime. But this bishop didn't speak out on any of those. This bishop hasn't spoken out to this time. So I have to wonder, is this bishop jumping on a bandwagon? Now, CBS News lists this bishop's home base, this bishop's city, all right, as being a leader as one of the nation's most deadliest cities. But this bishop hasn't spoken out on that either. This bishop has said nothing. All right, my point here isn't to call this bishop out. This bishop's actions or inactions does that on their own. But my concern is that as leaders in church, as leaders in any denomination, it's our responsibility to do for the least of these among us. And Jesus commands it. We must do it. All right, we cannot sit idly by and wait for the bandwagon to roll by. We must be in command of the band, and we must have the reins of the wagon at all times. These are important times, made all the more tragic by those who are exploiting the death of George Floyd to fit a wide range of narratives. As church leaders, we must show compassion to all. We must care for the many, and we must always be truthful in what we say and in our actions. Ephesians 4:25 says, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with your neighbor, for we are all members of one another. All right, so we're being told again that we've got to be truthful. We have to put away all the falsehoods. We cannot play into them, and we cannot perpetrate them, and we should not further the cause of a false narrative or fake news. We have to be truthful, even if it hurts. We have to be truthful with one another, because if we're not truthful, we can't hold each other accountable. And we must do that as Christians. That's part of being a Christian, is holding each other accountable. All right, so as I said earlier, since January 1st, 257 predominantly black lives have been killed in Chicago. All right? In Richmond, Virginia, which is close to our home base, the biggest city close to our home base, really, 21 murders. 21. All right? We should be speaking out against all senseless acts of violence. We can't be silent, and we must not let anyone change the narrative from police brutality to systemic racism where there are no indicators that exist in that instance. The George Floyd video makes it very clear that his death was a senseless act of violence in itself. It was a murder. clear cut. He was murdered. All right. We need to stay razor focused on the issues surrounding Floyd's death. All right. And this is not the time for us to be flaming the fires again that are burning our nation to this day. But let me be clear. I want to really be clear on this. We do have issues of racism in America. But that is not isolated just to the white community. There are many communities across our nation that have issues of racism, and we need to tackle all of those issues, every single one of them. All right, we need to work on these issues, but we will make no progress. We will make no progress if we simply wait for the next bandwagon. Until next time, I pray that each and every one of you can find truth in your daily interactions with others. Find truth in what you say on social media. Find truth in what you send out in messages and text and emails. Find the truth in everything that you do, even if it hurts. All right? Even if it hurts. We have to have that accountability. So I pray these things for you, and I hope that each of you knows the peace of Jesus Christ and that you share it with someone around you in the coming days.